She stood in front of the small, fog-blurred mirror, the kind bolted to the wall as if even reflections needed permission to exist here. The bikini felt unreal on her skin, too light, too revealing, too bold for a girl who had spent her whole life hiding behind uniforms, sleeves, and expectations. For a moment she didn't move. Then, almost timidly, she lifted her chin and looked at herself fully. Her eyes traveled down a body she had never allowed herself to examine. The gentle line of her shoulders. The curve of her waist. The quiet strength in her legs. The soft, natural symmetry she had ignored all her life, because good daughters were not supposed to think of beauty, not their own, not like this. She wasn't posing. She wasn't trying. She was simply seeing. And for the first time she realized she was beautiful. Not loudly, not carelessly, beautiful in a way that hurt a little, like discovering something precious you were never meant to touch. And the moment that realization bloomed inside her, fear followed. Because if she could see it, then they would see it. The American men outside. The eyes she didn't want. The attention she never asked for. A hot flush rose to her cheeks. She pressed her palms to her face, wishing she could hide inside her own hands. Stepping out in this foreign, fragile piece of cloth felt like walking unarmored into enemy fire. But the knock on the door was coming. She knew it. And this mirror, this tiny stolen moment, was the last place she could choose who she was. She would remember that mirror for the rest of her life. Not for the bikini, not for the shame, but because it was the first place she realized she was still alive. And outside that narrow room, beyond the thin wooden door and the voices of American guards drifting in faintly with the dust and sunlight, there existed a world she had not yet been allowed to understand. To grasp what was waiting for her, you have to step back from that mirror, away from her trembling breath, and into the machinery that had quietly shaped her fate long before she arrived at this camp. America's prisoner of war system during World War II was enormous, ordered, and, by the standards of the era, astonishingly humane. The United States had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, and unlike many nations engulfed in the chaos of total war, it actually followed it. More than 425 POW camps sprouted across the country, stretching from the desert of Arizona to the rolling fields of the Midwest. These were places built not merely to confine men, but to manage them within a framework of rules the military took seriously, sometimes more seriously than the prisoners themselves believed possible. Guards later recalled a mantra passed down through training, a phrase repeated so often it became doctrine: America fed its prisoners the same rations as its own men. You could taste the practicality in that policy. If a soldier ate beans and bread, so did the enemy behind the fence. If a soldier got medical care, so did the captured man in worn-out boots. At 4 o'clock into our timeline, this context matters because it is the soil in which her story took root, a system prepared for thousands of soldiers, but utterly unprepared for someone like her. If the American system was rigid, almost bureaucratic in its humanity, the world she came from was shaped by something very different. Fear sharpened into doctrine. Imperial Japan's propaganda had carved psychological trenches far deeper than any battlefield crater. By the time her transport ship fell into American hands, she had already lived through a lifetime of warnings, whispered, shouted, drilled into bone, that capture meant dishonor, degradation, something worse than death. On the island of Saipan, entire families leaped from cliffs rather than let American forces reach them. The military police, the Captivity, spread stories that Americans tortured prisoners, ate them, humiliated women until they begged for death. None of it had to be true, it only had to be loud. Fear was a weapon long before bullets, one historian wrote, and her world had been built on the echo of that weapon. So when she stood in front of that mirror, fingers trembling against the straps of a foreign garment, shame was only one layer of what she felt. Beneath it was something older, colder, the belief that walking out of that room would not only expose her skin but doom her very soul. At 4:45 in our journey, this is the weight she carried. What made her story extraordinary, almost impossible on paper, was the simple fact that she existed at all within these fences. Female POWs were nearly unheard of in the American system. Women captured at sea were usually treated as civilians. Many were repatriated early, traded, or relocated far from male-dominated facilities. The few who ended up in camps like this were anomalies, statistical outliers caught in the machinery of war. Some were nurses taken when hospital ships were sunk. Some were civilian internees swept up because the ocean did not care about their gender when it swallowed their vessels whole. She was one of the few, a later archivist would write almost with disbelief. And that rarity shaped every minute of her captivity. A camp designed for thousands of young men had no blueprint for someone like her. No clothing protocol, no privacy measures, no system. She was a problem the manual had not anticipated. And yet, somehow she endured. At 5:30 we acknowledged the strangeness of her presence here, not as a flaw in the historical record, but as the very reason this story survives. And what, then, was daily life in these American camps? Far from the front lines, routine replaced gunfire. The air hummed with structure. Morning roll call, labor assignments, idling afternoons, the distant thrum of trucks on gravel roads. Work was everywhere, chopping wood, tending crops, repairing fences, and prisoners were paid in canteen coupons for their labor, small allowances that could buy tobacco, stationery, or sweets. Work was not punishment. It was purpose, one guard remembered. Some men learned English. Others carved elaborate wooden toys that later ended up in American attics for decades. There were soccer matches, crude orchestras, even makeshift classrooms. Medical care was consistent, sometimes shockingly generous compared to the hardships outside the fences of war-torn Europe and Asia. And yet, despite all this structure, none of it straightforwardly applied to her. Men could fall into the rhythm of work and camaraderie. She had no such rhythm waiting. At 6:15, daily life becomes a backdrop to her isolation, an ordered world she observed from the margins of the barracks, always near but never part of it. And then, unexpectedly, she found a bridge, one woven not from policy or command but from another woman. German POW women were not common either, but they appeared more often, usually as civilian internees swept up alongside their husbands or arrested as enemy nationals. They were not soldiers in uniform. Many had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time when the war redrew the boundaries beneath their feet. One of them, a quiet woman with sharp eyes and a calm, brittle kind of patience, crossed her path. Between them lay every possible barrier, language, culture, trauma, but also one undeniable truth: they were anomalies in a world built for men. And anomalies find each other. She found a friend in the unlikeliest place, the records would later note at 7 o'clock. The friendship would matter, more than they expected, more than anyone around them understood. And so, the girl in the mirror steps out of the bathroom, trembling, into a camp built for soldiers, ruled by rules that were never designed for her. Behind her stands the world that made her afraid. Before her stands the world that does not yet know what to do with her. Her story begins here. She would later say that meeting the German woman was the moment she stopped feeling like a shadow in someone else's war. But to understand who she was, who she had been before the mirror, before the fear, you have to go back to the place that shaped her long before the Pacific swallowed her path. Her name, for the sake of this story, will be Keiko. A simple name. A quiet one. The kind that fits a girl who grew up in the rural folds of Japan, where the mountains pressed close and the fields stretched outward like green sighs. Wartime shortages had hollowed out village life. Rice measured by the cup, cloth patched until the threads forgot their original purpose. Neighbors trading favors the way wealthier places traded money. Children worked early. Adults worked always. Yet the land taught discipline and the seasons taught patience. She grew up watching the horizon for storms, an elderly neighbor once recalled, because storms meant ruined crops, ruined months, ruined futures. At 7:45 in our timeline, Keiko's childhood is both ordinary and harsh, the kind of life where endurance becomes second nature and softness is a luxury rarely afforded. Her capture came like a story someone else wrote for her, abrupt, senseless, impossible. She had been at sea, part of a civilian group moving between islands for reasons that blurred in later retellings. Evacuation, reassignment, perhaps simply being on the wrong boat at the wrong time. Japanese vessels sank often in those years, struck by submarines or swallowed by storms no one had time to name. Keiko's ship met both misfortune and mercy. Some accounts say it was a hospital ship that pulled survivors from the water. Others suggest an American vessel on patrol spotted the wreckage bobbing like broken teeth in the dawn light. What mattered was that she lived long enough to be taken aboard, shivering, half-conscious, clinging to driftwood with fingers already starting to stiffen in the cold. She survived the sea but not the war, one American medic wrote at 8:30, summing up the cruel irony of her fate. Living did not mean freedom, being rescued did not mean returning home. She became a number, a classification, a problem to process. But she was alive. Her expectations of the Americans who processed her were already carved into her bones long before she ever heard English spoken at close range. Japanese indoctrination didn't just warn civilians about capture, it built entire myths. Americans were said to be predators, torturers, devils in human skin. They were described as towering, merciless creatures who collected bodies the way farmers collected bundles of wheat. Keiko had heard these stories since childhood from teachers, radio broadcasts, military pamphlets, and whispered rumors carried by soldiers on leave. Even in the water, while being pulled aboard the rescue vessel, she had braced herself for cruelty. Death even seemed preferable to the future she had been taught to expect. They were supposed to be monsters, she remembered later, not with embarrassment, but with the quiet astonishment of someone whose worldview had cracked open. At 9:10, we acknowledged the tension between myth and reality, tension that would shape her first days in captivity as sharply as fear itself. And into that uncertainty stepped someone she never expected, the German woman. Her name, lost to archives and blurred by contradictory testimonies, does not need to be fixed here for her presence to matter. She had been a civilian internee, one of the many Europeans swept up in wartime relocations, caught between nations without ever raising a weapon. She spoke English with effort, Japanese not at all, yet she carried an ease around Americans that Keiko could not understand. Their first interaction was almost accidental, a shared waiting space, a guard who didn't know where to place either of them, a moment too long for silence to hold. The German woman noticed the trembling in Keiko's hands, the way she avoided eye contact, the tension that radiated from her like heat. And instead of stepping away, she stepped closer. She touched Keiko's sleeve gently, like handling something fragile that needed reassurance rather than fear. "Let me help you. You're safe with me," she said, words Keiko barely understood but somehow felt. And so, at 9:55, the two women became allies in a place where nationality mattered less than simple humanity. A German woman, a Japanese girl, both displaced, both anomalies, both trying to survive a system built for other people. But even friendship could not prepare Keiko for the strangest cultural shock she would face, one that came wrapped not in violence or ideology but in fabric. The moment she first saw a bikini is almost folkloric in how it appears in the archives. Half reported, half remembered, always tinged with disbelief. Early two-piece swimwear existed in the United States long before the war ended, though far more modest than the versions that would scandalize Europe after 1946. To Americans it was beachwear, to Keiko, it was practically a provocation. She had never seen so much exposed skin on a garment meant for public use. When one was handed to her, perhaps due to shortages, perhaps due to administrative oversight, it felt less like clothing and more like an impossible request. She held it between her fingers, turning it over as though it were a puzzle with no solution. In her hands, modern freedom felt like scandal, one later account noted at 10:35. The German woman tried to reassure her, even laughed softly at the absurdity of it all, but Keiko could only stare. How could something so small be considered normal? How could she be expected to wear it? How could this thin barrier of fabric stand between her and the world she feared? Yet she would wear it. She would step into that bathroom, stand before that mirror, and confront the impossible combination of shame, survival, and awakening. And everything that followed, the friendships, the conflicts, the quiet revelations, would begin from that moment when she, Keiko, held modernity in her hands and did not know whether to fear it or flee from it. Keiko's first true struggle in the camp was not hunger or fear, or the uncertainty of her future. It was the quiet war inside her own skin. Stepping out in a bikini meant violating rules she had lived with since childhood, unspoken, unquestioned laws of modesty woven so deeply into her identity that breaking them felt like breaking herself. Japanese culture did not forbid beauty, but it demanded restraint, grace, and concealment. Exposure was not just embarrassing, it was shameful. It hinted at impropriety, disobedience, a failure of character. And now she stood in a tiny changing room, the thin American fabric clinging to her like a confession she had never meant to make. She felt naked even thinking about it. At 11 o'clock in our timeline, the conflict is not between her and the Americans. It is between her and the person she was taught to be. Every instinct told her to cover up, to hide, to refuse. But the German woman's gentle encouragement lingered in her ears. "You're safe. It's just swimming." Still, shame wrapped around her ribs like a tightening band, and stepping outside felt like stepping onto a stage she didn't choose. When she finally did, the world reacted in a way she had dreaded and misunderstood. The American guards, lounging near the pool under the sharp California sun, let out a chorus of whistles and cheers. Not cruel, not predatory, simply American. Casual. Unfiltered. They meant no harm, but she didn't know that yet. Their joy felt loud, invasive, overwhelming. Back home, men did not vocalize approval of a woman's appearance in public. They certainly did not do it with that kind of careless, boyish enthusiasm. Keiko froze, heat flooding her face, her hands instinctively moving to cover herself even though there was nothing more to cover. The German woman whispered reassurance, but Keiko heard only noise, only the rush of her heartbeat drowning out every explanation. At 11:45, the gap between cultures becomes a chasm, one defined not by intention, but by the unbearable weight of misunderstanding. Yet amid the chaos of embarrassment, something unexpected began to unfold. The American soldiers assigned to teach swimming approached her with a patience that contrasted sharply with the rowdy greetings she had just endured. They spoke softly, motioned gently, and kept a respectful distance. One of them, a young corporal with sunburned shoulders, knelt by the poolside and tapped the water lightly, as if inviting a skittish animal to drink. "Take your time. We've got all day," he said, not knowing how profoundly those words would land. For Keiko, time had been a weapon. Urgency, orders, commands, these had shaped her life since childhood. No one had ever offered her time as a kindness. The water was warm, the air even warmer, and for the first time she sensed something unfamiliar, the idea that her comfort mattered to someone else. At 12:30, this becomes the beginning of her quiet education, not just in swimming but in trust. But trust is fragile, especially for someone who carried the Pacific in her memories. As she waded deeper into the pool, the soft ripples against her legs triggered sudden flashes, screams swallowed by waves, bodies drifting in the open sea, the metallic taste of fear as salt water filled her mouth. She gasped, her hands gripping the edge of the pool until her knuckles turned white. The soldiers paused, reading her panic instantly. Trauma has no language barrier. One of them stepped back, motioning for space, while another gently lowered his voice to a near whisper. Keiko closed her eyes, fighting the sensation of losing control. The water felt safer than memory, yet memory refused to loosen its grip. She stood trembling in the shallow end as the sun reflected in trembling shards around her. At 13:20, we see not fear of Americans but fear of the past, an ocean she is still learning to cross. And then, in a moment so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the significance it held, something shifted. As she kicked tentatively, the corporal gave her a playful splash, small, harmless, almost childlike. Keiko startled, blinking water from her eyes, and when she looked up, he was grinning at her with a gentleness that felt impossible in wartime. Something inside her cracked, not painfully but softly, like ice thawing on a spring morning. Her lips twitched. Then, without meaning to, she smiled. Not a big smile, not a confident one, just a fragile, fleeting curve that carried more meaning than laughter ever could. The German woman, watching from the steps, raised her hand in quiet celebration. For a moment she forgot she was a prisoner, one witness wrote later. At 1400 hours, this moment becomes the first real sign that Keiko's world is changing, not because the war has ended, but because a small part of her has finally begun to heal. Her journey continues from here, shaped by kindness she never expected to find, in a place she never wanted to be. What Keiko didn't know, what she couldn't have known in those first trembling steps into American life, was that the kindness she was beginning to feel was not an accident. It was a philosophy, built long before she ever saw the California sun reflecting off the water. The United States had chosen a different path in its treatment of prisoners, guided not only by the Geneva Convention but by something older in its national character. Humanity was a strategy as much as a value. American commanders understood that a man or a woman, treated with dignity, was less likely to resist, less likely to escape, far more likely to cooperate. The goal was stability, not punishment, order, not revenge. Keiko didn't know the policies or the legal terms. She didn't know about oversight committees or congressional directives. She simply felt the result of a system built on the belief that even in war, there were lines a nation should not cross. At 1445, the stage is set. America's approach to captivity is not perfect, not flawless, but profoundly different from what she had been taught to expect. The guards themselves were living proof of that difference. They were not monsters. Most were small-town boys who had grown up milking cows, fixing pickups, sweeping the floors of family shops. They carried rifles, but they carried kindness too. Their accents came from places Keiko couldn't imagine. Kansas wheat fields, Ohio steel towns, Florida orange groves. They joked the way brothers do, teased the way cousins do, and protected their charges with the steady confidence of men raised to respect rules. They were homesick. They were young. Some were barely older than the prisoners they supervised. And when they looked at Keiko or the German woman or any of the other internees, they didn't see enemies. They saw people caught in the same storm they were. At 1530, this contrast becomes clear. The uniform they wore was government-issued, but the humanity underneath it belonged to the towns that raised them. Work became another bridge, one Keiko didn't expect. She had feared forced labor, humiliation, the stripping of dignity that wartime propaganda had promised. Instead, she discovered structure, fairness, even wages. The Americans paid their prisoners for labor, modestly but honestly. They tracked hours, recorded attendance, ensured that no one was overworked. Red Cross officials visited regularly, checking conditions, speaking privately with prisoners to confirm their treatment. Keiko was stunned when she received her first small payment. Paper money marked for camp use but real nonetheless. It felt unreal to be compensated rather than exploited. The Japanese system she had known taught that the defeated owed their labor to the victor. Here, labor was a partnership. Work wasn't humiliation. It was a way forward. At 1615, the ideological gulf becomes visible. America believed that dignity was not a reward. It was a right. As weeks passed, cultural exchanges began to blossom in places where no one expected them. The German internees taught songs and old folk recipes. The Americans shared slang, baseball scores, and stories of high school sweethearts waiting back home. Sometimes Keiko would sit at the edge of a gathering and simply listen, lost in conversation she barely understood. She heard laughter in languages she didn't know. She saw men who had once fought on opposite sides now trade jokes across picnic tables. It was confusing, surreal, and quietly beautiful. The war outside the fences raged on, but inside the camp, something warmer had started to grow. Human curiosity, human softness, human connection. At 1700 hours, this becomes a quiet testament to how people rebuild bridges even while nations burn them. And somewhere in the middle of all this, between swimming lessons and shared meals, between broken English and hesitant smiles, Keiko's heart began to shift in ways she didn't recognize at first. The Americans no longer felt like distant figures. They became individuals with names, quirks, habits, tempers, and kindnesses. The fear she carried like a second skin began to crack, piece by piece, replaced by something she had been too wary to allow: trust. She noticed how the guards looked away politely when she climbed out of the pool, how they never touched her without permission, how they spoke gently when she struggled with English. Kindness breaks walls stronger than barbed wire. At 1745, that truth becomes the turning point. Keiko wasn't ready to call America her future, but for the first time she no longer saw it as her doom. The world inside the camp had offered her something Japan's propaganda never prepared her for: decency, respect, space to breathe, space to heal. Her transformation was beginning, subtle but unstoppable, like dawn rising over a darkened ocean. Keiko's turning point arrived on an afternoon that began like any other: dry heat, slow hours, and the quiet hum of camp routine, until a sharp pain tore through her abdomen and dropped her to her knees. For a moment she thought it was shame, or panic, or some ghost of wartime malnutrition. But then the world tilted, darkened, vanished. When she woke, she was already in the camp infirmary, surrounded by clean sheets and the smell of antiseptic. The American medical staff moved with brisk confidence. Nurses checking her pulse, a doctor shining light into her eyes, an interpreter kneeling beside her to explain what was happening. She learned later that a guard had carried her there, shouting for help. They didn't question her worth. They didn't hesitate. They saved her without hesitation. At 1830, this becomes more than a medical incident. It becomes a revelation. Everything she had been taught to believe, that Americans were cruel, that surrender meant suffering, crumbled the moment their hands steadied her trembling body. Through the haze of pain and exhaustion, she noticed a figure sitting beside her bed. A young guard, the kind whose freckles made him look more schoolboy than soldier, had been assigned to watch over her. But he stayed even after his shift, legs folded awkwardly under the chair, hat clutched in his hands. Testimonies from camp guards would later describe how often they felt protective, how they saw prisoners not as combatants but as frightened strangers far from home. Now Keiko saw that truth firsthand. "You're going to be okay, ma'am," he told her softly, as if speaking to a sister, or perhaps someone he hoped would survive so he could believe the world still made sense. She didn't understand every word, but the tone was unmistakable. At 1910, the intimacy of compassion bridged a chasm wider than language. Lying in that infirmary cot, listening to the shuffle of nurses and the gentle hum of the air, Keiko felt something inside her snap, but not in the way she feared. It wasn't her body. It was her fear. It broke cleanly like a brittle shell falling away. She no longer saw enemies. Only people. The Americans who tended to her, who adjusted her blanket, who checked her temperature, they were not the monsters she had imagined. They were caretakers in uniforms. She had read accounts of POWs expressing gratitude for their treatment, but she had never understood the depth of that shift until now. Gratitude was not passive. It was transformative. At 1950, her entire world reordered itself around a single truth. Kindness could disarm the heart more effectively than any weapon. When Keiko was well enough to walk again, she stepped out into the bright yard with a clarity she had never known. The camp no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a threshold, an in-between place where she could decide who she wanted to become. Soon after, when the voluntary work program was announced, tasks assisting nurses, organizing supplies, helping maintain communal spaces, Keiko didn't wait for others to move first. She stepped forward, unafraid. The guards exchanged glances, surprised by how quickly she volunteered, but they welcomed her with nods and gentle smiles. Her decision wasn't about obligation or necessity. It was an offering. A sign that she accepted the possibility of a future shaped not by fear but by cooperation. At 2030, this act marks her first conscious embrace of American goodwill. The turning point had arrived quietly without fanfare, but it altered everything that would come after. Keiko no longer walked with her shoulders tight or her gaze lowered. She belonged, not to a nation, not to a cause, but to the fragile, beautiful hope that people, even in war, could choose compassion over cruelty. After that turning point, Keiko's days settled into a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike, a slow reclamation of life itself. The camp, once a place of fear and expectation, began to reveal pockets of peace. Mornings were for chores and lessons, afternoons for swimming, sports, and small competitions that reminded her of a life before bombs and propaganda. Holiday events, strangely familiar in their cheer, with makeshift decorations and communal meals, offered a taste of normalcy she had never thought possible. She watched the others laugh, play, and sometimes quarrel, and she realized that the war outside the fences was not the only world that mattered. For the first time she felt the war fading, not because the fighting had stopped, but because inside these fences, life was reclaiming its own pulse. At 2110, the rhythm of camp life becomes more than routine. It is survival, yes, but also a form of quiet triumph. Keiko's presence did not go unnoticed. The American guards, those small-town boys with freckles and sunburned shoulders, began to treat her with something warmer than mere supervision. They gave her a nickname, Sunshine, a word that carried no irony, no condescension, only an acknowledgement of the brightness she brought into the camp. It was a gesture of acceptance, simple and human, but for Keiko it meant everything. The nickname traveled quietly among the other prisoners, across languages and nationalities, marking her as someone who had claimed a place in this strange, temporary society. They called her Sunshine. At 2150, we see how reputation can be an act of intimacy, and how small gestures can heal the lingering shadows of fear. Language, too, became a bridge to possibility. Keiko began lessons in English, often sitting with the German woman or one of the kind-hearted guards, laboring over words that felt foreign in both sound and rhythm. Every new word opened a tiny window into a world she had only glimpsed in newspapers, films, and overheard conversation. Every new word felt like a new world, she noted in her diary years later. The act of learning was more than communication. It was empowerment, a tool for independence, a signal that she could imagine a life beyond the fences. At 2230, the process of acquiring language becomes a metaphor for her growing agency, a subtle, patient way of reclaiming her story. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, America became more than a place where she was kept safe. it became a dream. Not the grand ideal of cities and money, but a sense of possibility, of dignity, of hope that had nothing to do with uniformed soldiers or propaganda. She watched other Japanese POWs make similar discoveries. Some declined repatriation when the war ended, drawn not to a country but to a promise of respect and the chance to build anew. She found freedom where she expected fear, her journal would later reflect. At 2310, this internal transformation cements her path. America is no longer the unknown enemy, no longer a place of shame, it is a home in waiting, a sanctuary shaped not by geography, but by the humanity she has been shown. Her impact rippled quietly through the camp, not in headlines or reports, but in smiles, conversations, and small acts of shared understanding. She became proof that fear can be dismantled, that kindness can redefine what captivity means, and that even in war the smallest gestures of dignity can leave the deepest marks. The guns went silent before dawn, though Keiko hardly noticed. VJ Day had arrived, and the world beyond the fences erupted in cheers, radio broadcasts, and celebrations that seemed almost unreal from inside the camp. Soldiers began packing their bags, preparing to return home, while prisoners waited for instructions, uncertain of what freedom might feel like or where it might take them. For Keiko, the noise outside could not compete with the rhythm of her own heart, the slow, steady pulse of someone who had survived, learned, and grown. The guns went silent, but her heart was louder. At 2350, the war outside finally aligned with a personal victory inside, a quiet release from the fear that had once been her constant companion. When the time came to return the Japanese prisoners to their homeland, Keiko made a decision that surprised even the camp administrators. While most of her fellow nationals prepared for repatriation, she stepped forward with a request that had once seemed impossible. She would remain in the United States. She refused repatriation. It was not a rejection of her past, nor a betrayal of her country. It was an acknowledgement of where she had found care, respect, and humanity. America had given her dignity, and she was determined to claim the life that dignity had promised. At 2400 hours 30, this becomes the most intimate proof of transformation, an act of will that embodies trust, gratitude, and the courage to redefine one's own path. Her next steps were deliberate, measured, and full of hope. Keiko applied for U.S. citizenship, navigating a process designed to integrate those whose lives had been altered by war. She filled out forms, met with officials, and signed papers that carried far more weight than ink on parchment. Each signature was deliberate, each question answered with quiet determination. She signed her name with steady hands, not because it was required, but because in that act she was claiming her future. At 25:10, citizenship becomes a symbol not only of legal status but of personal triumph. Proof that the human spirit can adapt, endure, and embrace a second chance. And she was not alone in this journey. The veterans and guards who had once carried rifles alongside her, who had ensured her comfort and safety in small, ordinary ways, stood by her long after the war ended. They wrote letters, offered guidance, and opened doors that might have otherwise remained closed. Their support was not a spectacle, it was quiet, consistent, and deeply human. They stood by her long after the war, records would note at 25:50. In their continued care, Keiko found affirmation that kindness, once offered, can echo across years and miles, shaping lives long after conflict has passed. The legacy of these gestures, the humanity of both captors and caretakers, was woven into her story, a reminder that the actions of ordinary people can create extraordinary change. In the end, the camp, the mirror, the pool, the laughter, and the care all became threads in a life that no longer belonged solely to war. Keiko had survived, learned, and chosen. She had been shown that dignity is not given only to allies, and that kindness has the power to rewrite the narrative of fear. Her life after the war would be proof that humanity is more than a principle. It is a force shaping futures, opening doors, and allowing a single girl, once trapped in fear, to step fully into freedom. Keiko built her new life slowly, like a garden grown from soil long neglected. She learned to navigate American streets, customs, and language with the patience she had cultivated in the camp. Jobs came, friends arrived, and a sense of belonging, once unimaginable, took root. She married, raised a family, and contributed to her community, all while carrying the memories of a childhood in Japan and the uncertain days in captivity. She carried two histories but one heart, a heart that had learned both fear and generosity, restraint and freedom, pain and hope. At 26:30, her life embodies the resilience of those who survive war not only in body but in spirit. Through her story, we are reminded of the profound impact of humane treatment during conflict. The United States' commitment to upholding dignity, even toward prisoners of war, was not merely policy, it was philosophy in action. Mercy, decency, and respect were not abstract ideals, they were daily practice. Soldiers who extended care, doctors who tended wounds without hesitation, and a camp structure that emphasized fair labor all contributed to an environment in which a single individual could rediscover trust in humanity. Mercy is a legacy stronger than war, a truth that Keiko experienced firsthand and carried with her long after the uniforms were folded and the fences removed. At 27:10, this reflection bridges personal experience with a broader historical principle, highlighting the enduring power of human kindness. Her story reminds us why America chose another way, a way that embraced principles of decency, even in the shadow of global conflict. In the simplest gestures of care, the patience of guards, and the space to learn and grow, Keiko's life was transformed. From a frightened girl clutching a thin piece of swimwear to a confident citizen claiming her own future, she exemplifies the potential of humane action to change lives. At 27:50, we see that this is not just a story of one woman, one camp, or one war. It is a testament to the choices a nation makes and the power of those choices to nurture hope where despair once ruled. As her journey concludes, we are left with the quiet but unshakable truth. Under any circumstances, being humane is not simply moral, it is in America's ultimate interest. After the war, Keiko's life unfolded quietly, yet profoundly. She became an active member of her community, participating in local events, volunteering in schools, and sharing her story when asked, not for fame, but to teach the lessons she had learned in silence for so many years. She raised children who would know both her Japanese heritage and her American home, blending two worlds with grace and gratitude. She carried memories of the ocean, the camp, the pool, the German woman, and the soldiers who had shown her kindness, all woven into the tapestry of her everyday life. Each recollection reminded her that even in the darkest times, humanity could prevail. She visited former campsites years later, walking the grounds and reflecting on how far she had come. The waters where she had first learned to swim now seemed almost sacred, a symbol of transformation, trust, and the possibility of new beginnings. Keiko never forgot the small gestures, the guard who had sat with her in the infirmary, the nurses who had tended her injuries, the classmates who had shared language lessons and laughter. Each act of ordinary kindness had compounded into extraordinary impact, shaping her life and the choices she made. Keiko's story is a reminder that history is not only written in battles and treaties but also in compassion, courage, and respect. She illustrates how the human spirit responds to care and how dignity, once granted, can change a person's entire trajectory. For the audience, her journey is both inspiring and instructive. The measures we take to uphold humanity, even during conflict, ripple far beyond the immediate moment, leaving legacies that last for generations. Her journey concludes with a simple but powerful maxim: under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. This is not merely a moral statement, it is a principle proven in the quiet victories of lives like Keiko's, a lesson that resonates as deeply today as it did amid the turmoil of World War II. If you want to follow more stories like Keiko's and explore untold moments of humanity in wartime, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Join us as we continue uncovering the extraordinary acts of kindness and courage that history often leaves unspoken. Your subscription helps us preserve these lessons for the future, one story at a time.